But as soon as they see what is inside of this warehouse, they immediately lower their weapons and just stare in abject horror. In Nigeria, motorcycle taxi drivers are called Okadas. These Ibadan Okadas are actually a fairly tight-knit community made up primarily of young men. And so in early 2014, when 2 of these Okadas went missing, the community immediately found out about it and was really concerned. And when the police did not appear to be doing much to actually go out and find these 2 guys, the community of Okadas decided to launch a search of their own. But despite their best efforts, they never could find them. Then, on March 22nd of that year, a 3rd Ibadan Okada vanished. He was a young man named Lanre Sadiku, and unlike the other 2 riders who went missing while they were at home, Lanre went missing while he was working. And then out of nowhere, Lanre actually calls this group of riders. He said that he and 8 other people he was with, who he didn't even know, had been kidnapped, and their kidnappers had brought them to this underground prison cell. They couldn't see anything, but they could hear people walking above them. And so these Okada riders who are getting this call from Lanre, they're horrified, and they're trying to calm Lanre down so he can explain where he is so they can go find him. And finally, Lanre, he does compose himself, and he gives them really specific directions to this footpath that led into the Soka forest where he said he had been taken. They all began looking for the 2 burned out cars that Lanre had said marked the beginning of this footpath they were looking for. And so sure enough, they find these burned out cars, they park all their bikes off on the shoulder of the road, and they quickly realize that this really is a footpath only. And so as these men are basically marching into the woods, they're not making any sound because they're trying to listen for the sound of their friend and the other people that have been taken captive, when all of a sudden the guy at the front of the line thinks he hears something way up ahead. And so he holds his hand up to stop the line, and they all stop and they're trying to listen. And then all of a sudden, about 50 feet ahead of them through the trees, this man they didn't recognize suddenly jumped out from behind a tree. He yelled something at them, and then he raised his gun and began firing in their direction. The 40 Okadas immediately turn around and just sprint back down the path, right back out to the road. They hop on their bikes and they peel back out towards the city. When they finally get back to the meetup spot they had all originated from, they realized they can't just leave Lanre and the other people he was with out to dry. They have to go back and rescue them. And this huge posse of over 100 men all hopped on their bikes and headed back towards that footpath that led into the forest. When they got there, they put their bikes on the side of the road, and this time, when they started walking down that path, they had guns, knives, bats, all sorts of weapons, and they were not trying to be quiet. They were actually yelling like these loud war cries to let the gunmen and any other gunmen in the woods know that there was a horde of angry people that were coming into the woods for a fight. After quite a while, they walk out of the thick forest into this huge opening, and right in the middle of this huge clearing is this fairly small river, but it's big enough that it would be very difficult to cross. However, they can see there's a bridge that goes over this river. They can see there are 2 dilapidated buildings. The one that is closer to the bridge is this small black shack that has a window looking out towards them, and then the other building was much bigger than the shack. It was this huge kind of broken down warehouse that had big tall cement walls, and then all around it was this huge chain link fence with barbed wire wrapped around the tops. And as they get on the bridge, they're kind of scanning the 2 buildings, they're not seeing anybody, and then one of the men, they look down underneath the bridge and they actually see Lanre's motorcycle. And so the men, they get over the bridge, they go to that first building, that black shack, and they open up the door. It's a plywood door, and there's no one inside, but the shack is literally stuffed full of hundreds and hundreds of articles of clothing and shoes. The posse moved on from the black shack and made their way up to the fence right in front of this huge warehouse. And so they begin yelling into the warehouse for anyone in there to show yourselves, come out here. But it was silent. And so one of the Okadas that was part of the posse had brought along bolt cutters as a weapon to use as a club if he needed to. But as it happened, he began to use the bolt cutters for their actual purpose, and he bent down and actually cut a huge hole in this fence so they could go in and explore this warehouse. And so after a large percentage of this posse had gotten inside the fence line, they began walking around this huge warehouse to try to find an entrance inside. They walk around this structure, and when they get to the very back, back, they find an entrance. All it is this big rusted piece of tin metal, like sheet metal, that's propped up against a gap in the walls of the warehouse. And so one of the Okadas grabs this piece of metal and he pushes it out of the way. But as soon as they see what is inside of this warehouse, they immediately lower their weapons and just stare in abject horror. According to the locals who lived actually in the forest relatively near where this warehouse was, they said there was actually another way to get to this particular area. There was another path that was very rough, but it was big enough for one vehicle that came in from the other direction. Now, the locals said they didn't use this path at all. They didn't even know where it originated from. But they said for the last 10 years or more, they have seen one vehicle use this road all the time to get to the warehouse. And it was this black Jeep with black tinted out windows, and they said it would typically show up most nights of the week. For the last 10 years, every time this guy was over near the warehouse from 8 to 9:30 at night, they would typically hear screams coming from that part of the woods, coming from the warehouse. And when the locals brought their concerns to police, the police just kind of blew it off and didn't do anything about it, and actually told the people, don't worry about it. Had the police followed up on the locals' concerns about this Jeep and the screams, they would have discovered that that warehouse was actually a storage facility for a very in-demand and very illegal product. And that man who drove that black Jeep, he would take this illegal product and he would bring it back with him in batches and he would sell it on the black market. When this posse of 100 plus Okadas pulled that metal door aside and they stepped into the warehouse surveying what's in front of them, the first thing they noticed is right in the middle of the structure on the ground is this cement slab. It's about 4 feet by 4 feet, and one corner of this slab was elevated slightly by some rocks that had been placed under it, kind of propping it up, pitching it on an angle. Around this cement slab, all over the dirt floor, were bones, some with meat on them. And then beyond the bones and beyond the slab, all around the perimeter of the inside of this building were extremely malnourished, catatonic people chained up to the walls. These people were the highly in-demand, highly illegal product. More specifically, their body parts were the product. In Nigeria, a stunning number of people believe that certain magic potions and charms will grant you wealth and success, and in some cases, infinite life. But the catch is, the herbalists who will perform the magical rituals and give these potions and charms to people that pay for them, they often require human body parts for them to work. And so the way it's believed it worked at the Soka Forest warehouse was the man in the black Jeep. He would get orders from people that wanted specific body parts for their magical potions and charms and whatever else they needed, and he would make a list of those parts, and then at 8 p.m. he would show up at the warehouse and he would communicate with the people that worked at that warehouse, and they would determine out of all the captives they had who had the parts they needed. And then after figuring out which captives were going to be used that night, they would go into the main section of the warehouse, and one by one they would unchain these people, they would drag them to the center of the room, and in full view of all the other captives, they would put them on the slab known as the slaughtering slab, and they would the required body parts and would bag them up, put them in coolers, and then the man with the black Jeep, he would take those parts and he would leave. And then the person who's just been butchered, if they were still alive and might have a chance of surviving, they'd just be brought back to the wall and chained up again. If they did not have a good chance of survival, then they'd be brought to the very back of the warehouse in the back rooms where they would be discarded. Now, the means of execution varied, but in the back rooms of this warehouse, they found a makeshift guillotine, and they also found a large crocodile that was chained up. And so it's likely that those were at least two of the methods used. After the Okadas kind of broke out of their initial shock of what they were seeing inside of this warehouse, they went around and began freeing people that were still chained up to the walls. And in total, there were 23 people that were still barely alive, but none of them were Lanre Sadiku. And so later that day, when the police did come out, because word got out about this huge find out in this forest, the posse went to the police and begged them to please begin digging up this entire property. We need to find the entrance to this underground prison cell, but the police just kind of refused and immediately just demolished the warehouse. And then after kind of cordoning off that area for a couple of days, the police basically just left and stopped caring about it altogether. And so we don't know what happened to Lan Ray and the other people who were trapped in that underground cell. No one has ever been officially held accountable for the atrocities that took place in the Soka forest. It's believed the total number of victims is easily in the hundreds. However, a couple of days after the warehouse was discovered by the Okada posse, the posse was back digging, looking for Lan Ray, when they discovered there was this man who was there, who was kind of walking around acting suspicious. And so the posse confronted him, and it would turn out this guy had several human tongues in his pockets, along with dozens and dozens of cell phone SIM cards. And so, assuming he was part of whatever happened there, the Okada posse proceeded to kill the man on sight. Later on, a woman who was a survivor from the warehouse would tell reporters how she got kidnapped. She said she lived in Ibadan, she was well educated, she had a good family, she was just sitting outside of her house when all of a sudden this van pulled up in front of her, and these very official looking men were inside of this van, and they got out and they told her, you know, you're under arrest, you gotta come with us to the police station. And the woman was so confused, but the men were very professional and seemed very convincing, and so she got inside the van, they shut the door, and they drove off. And very quickly, once she was inside of the van and couldn't go anywhere, she realized they were not police, she had been kidnapped, and within the hour, she, along with several other people who had probably been kidnapped in the same way, were their clothes off right outside of that black shack on the other side of the river, and they were told to put their clothes and belongings inside of the shack while they were being held at gunpoint. And then once they were naked, they were promptly marched into that warehouse where virtually everyone around her would be butchered and killed.